Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Long here, finally, with our last video lecture for our first unit on the Enlightenment slash French Revolution. So, to make this as easy as possible, what we did a couple days ago is we took actual written notes from a video lecture on the three major mistakes that Napoleon makes as leader of France. And in the beginning of that video lecture, hopefully you guys all took notes on the major achievements that Napoleon made once he took over in France. So that's actually going to be the second half of the review for your exam. And what I'm about to go over right now will be the first half. And you will be able to use both sets of notes on your exam. So once again, everyone, it's really important that you not only write down what you see on the screen, but you also add all the other notes with the video lecture, because we always know that I always add more than what you just see on the screen. So the easiest way of doing this is to set up your notes so it's nice and organized and you're able to use your notes on the exam and not spend the entire period searching for a single answer. So it's probably a good idea to box in titles or keywords, people, highlight it, underline it, and so on. So we're going to go ahead and start off with major events that occur before the French Revolution breaks out. And there's actually four major events, or four reasons why the revolution ends up breaking out. So the first one has to do with the unfair class system, which is known as the Old Regime in France. And this is like the political and social system that was in place right before the revolution breaks out. And hopefully we all remember that the old regime is made up of three estates. The first estate is the church, which is also known as the clergy, and they make up 1% of the total population, and they control about 10% of all of the land in France. And they really don't pay any taxes whatsoever. They actually donate about 2% of their annual income for donations. So really, if you want to look at that as a tax, I guess we can, but 2% is very, very little. Moving on to the second estate. The second estate up is made up, of the nobility. And the nobles, remember, are born into that noble family. You cannot just say you want to be a noble. It has to be hereditary. It has to be through the family. And the nobles are going to make up 2% of the total population, and they're going to control about 20% of all of the land in France. And of course, they will pay nothing when it comes to taxes. So they are one of the richest people living in France, and of course, they don't pay any money at all in taxes. And that's going to leave us with a third estate. And the third estate is actually going to be made up of three different groups. The bourgeoisie, and the bourgeoisie are actually like middle class citizens, and they have decent jobs, they have good jobs, they make a decent amount of money, but they are not born into that noble family, and that's the big difference between them and the second estate. And the bourgeoisie are going to be forced to pay a lot of money in taxes. The next group that belongs to the third estate is the city laborers or the city workers. And last but not least, the third group is the peasants. And the peasants are going to make up the highest population of people that are living in France at the time. There's about 26 million people living in France before the revolution breaks out. And the peasants make up about 80% of the total population. So it's a very, very unfair class system. You have two classes of people that hardly pay any money, if not anything at all, in taxes. And then you have the rest, which is about 97% of the population, and they are responsible for paying all the taxes in France. So it's very, very unfair. So before moving on to the second event or second reason why the French Revolution breaks out is the Enlightenment. And we should be very, very familiar with the Enlightenment time period. We should know that the Enlightenment starts in France. We should know that it's a time period of new ideas, people thinking on their own, moving away from an absolute monarchy, moving away from people telling other people what to do, and moving towards people actually figuring things out on their own. The Enlightenment time period is also all about equality of rights and people all being equal to each other. So the Enlightenment is really, really going to play a huge part in the revolution when it breaks out, especially with the Third Estate, because the Third Estate basically gets fed up with the way they're being treated in France, and they're going to look towards these new Enlightenment ideas, and they're going to accept these and embrace these ideas, and that's going to help cause the revolution. The third reason why the revolution will break out is because of weak leadership. We should know who the king and queen of France is. It's Louis the 16th and Marie Antoinette. And I mentioned this before, but they get married at a very, very young age. Louis is only 15 years old, and Marie Antoinette is only 14 years old. And they become king and queen when they are 19 and 18 years old. So they're very young, they're very inexperienced. They really don't make any decisions on their own. Um, Louis the 16th is advised on a lot of decisions that he makes. And not to mention that there's a huge economic crisis in France, and really they live a very lavish lifestyle. They like nice things, they like nice clothes and palaces, and that costs lots of money. And they really are selfish, and they really only take care of themselves and their family, and they don't worry about the citizens of France. So that also becomes the third reason why the revolution ends up breaking out. And finally, last but not least, huge, huge economic problems in France. We should all remember that France has fought in several wars um, before the revolution breaks out. They helped us fight in the Revolutionary War against Great Britain. They also fought in the French and Indian War against Great Britain. And we should know that wars cost lots and lots of money. So France is in huge, huge debt, not to mention that France is also going through a really, really bad harvest season for crops. They experience a huge drought. And when there's a drought, there's no water. If there's no water, crops can't grow. And they also go through a really, really cold winter. And what ends up happening when all the snow and ice melts is that it floods all the fields and it destroys all the crops. So there's very, very little food. And the wheat that they grow in the fields, obviously they use wheat to make bread. And the bread that they sell in the stores, there's very little of it, so the price skyrockets. And of course, no one can afford bread. So there's a food shortage, and the food that they do have, excuse me, is very, very expensive, and no one can afford it. And once again, the French government, the king and queen are doing nothing about the problems in France at the time. So all of these things are all happening at once. And eventually it's going to break out into the revolution. So moving on. With that being said, and the economic problems going on in France, Louis needs to figure out how to get France out of debt. He needs to figure out how to get France some money. So what he does is he starts thinking about taxing. Well, if you're Louis, you need to figure out how you can get the most amount of money out of your people. And at this time, the Third Estate has been paying all the taxes. Nobles have never paid taxes before, but nobles have lots of money. So Louis comes up with the idea of trying to come up with a law to tax the nobles. And the nobles freak out and they say, no way. And they force Louis to call a huge, huge meeting. And this big meeting is known as the Estates General. And the Estates General has not been called for over 175 years in France. And the Estates General is basically a big meeting where representatives from the first, second, and third estate get together and they vote on certain laws. So the second estate forces Louis to call this huge estates general, this huge meeting. But the way they vote is very, very unfair. They don't vote based off of population. They vote off of a single vote. Each estate gets one vote and one vote only, regardless of how many people belong to that estate. And of course, the first estate and the second estate will always team up with each other. And their vote will always go against the third estate, which means the third estate once again suffers. So, with this being said, the third estate is going to break away from the old regime. And they are going to form a new government in France. And this is the beginning of the French Revolution. And they call that new government the National Assembly. And once again, it is made up of the third estate. They break away from the old regime, and their number one goal is to end absolute monarchy. And remember what an absolute monarch is. It's when a king or queen basically does whatever he or she wants to do, and no one can do anything about it. And really, everyone, we have to understand that this is really the first act of revolution, when they break away from the old regime and they start a brand new government. A few days later, unfortunately, though, the first and second estate do not recognize this National Assembly. They do not recognize this new government. So the first and second estate are actually having a meeting, and they don't invite the third estate. Well, the third estate find out that the first and second estate are having this meeting, and they're actually having a meeting in an indoor tennis court. And they lock out the third estate. They actually lock the door so they can't even get in. So what ends up happening, we should all remember this, this is a review, is that the third estate actually break down the door to the indoor tennis court. And they refuse to leave until a new constitution was created. So at this point, Louis needs to figure something out. And Louis sends in troops, and he sends in guards to put down this uprising that the third estate is creating. And because of Louis sending in troops and guards and soldiers, the French citizens are scared that he is trying to dissemble this new government that they started, the National Assembly. And they're also scared for themselves, their lives. And they arm themselves. They get weapons, they get their guns. But the problem is that they don't have enough gunpowder. So what ends up happening is that the French citizens, they storm the Bastille. When you storm something, what I mean by that is that they break in to the Bastille. The Bastille is an old French prison. And of course, they are looking for gunpowder. And when they are doing this, there's actually guards at the Bastille, and the French citizens kill the guards. And they get the gunpowder and they arm themselves. So that is a huge, huge event that happens. This is almost like our 4th of July. That's how they celebrate. That's almost like a holiday that we celebrate here, which is the 4th of July. So it's a really, really big deal, the storming of the Bastille for the French citizens. As a result of that, because the storming of the Bastille happens in the city, this also happens out in the countryside. So there's rumors that the nobles hired outlaws. And these outlaws, their job is to terrorize the peasants and to scare the peasants. So once again, the peasants are going to arm themselves. And the peasants actually take it a step further, and they break into some of the nobles' homes. And they start destroying legal documents that bound or tie the peasants to that land. So they get rid of the documents. And this was a huge, huge event that occurs in France during the very beginning of the French Revolution. Once again, moving back to the cities now, women begin to riot Women are very upset with the prices of bread. I've mentioned that before. There's a food shortage because of the bad harvesting and the bad weather, and the drought and the cold winters. And that causes the prices of wheat, which is used to make bread, to go way up. And people can't afford it. And people don't have jobs. People don't have money. And people are starting to starve. And when you start to starve, people will do anything to get food. And that's exactly what ended up happening in 1789. Women began to riot and they actually break into the royal palace looking for the king and queen and the royal family. And as a result of this, the royal family is forced to move to Paris and move away from their huge, extravagant palace in Versailles. So, as a result of this, all these different events occurring, we have this new government. This new government, which is the first government during the French Revolution, as known as the National Assembly, that the Third Estate starts when they break away from the old regime. Now, what they do is they create a very, very important document that was known as the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizens. And that sounds very, very similar to the Declaration of Independence that we have here in the United States, which of course was written by Thomas Jefferson, which of course he borrowed ideas from the great Enlightenment philosopher John Locke. So the French are actually looking at what happened here in the Americas. They look at Jefferson, they look at Locke, and their influence, and they create this document. And some of these rights will include liberty, property, security, and the resistance to oppression, meaning if a ruler is oppressing them or treating them badly, then they have the right to overthrow that ruler. Okay? Once again, that's a huge, huge idea that John Locke and Jefferson has. So once again, continuing with this National Assembly, this first government under the French Revolution, they do a couple important things. Remember, France is still in debt. That doesn't go away just because there's a new government. So the National Assembly decides to take all of the land away from the church. And remember, the church owns about 10% of the land in France, which is a lot. And they actually sell that land. And the money that they get from the land that they sell, they start to pay off the debt in France. The National Assembly also drafts a new constitution that Louis XVI is forced to sign. And this is really important because this is a transition from an absolute monarch to a limited constitutional monarchy, which means Louis is now responsible for following rules and laws just like all other French citizens. He can no longer do whatever he wants to do. And if he tries to, then there's going to be some sort of punishment or consequence. So this is a really, really big deal. Once again, all these ideas are coming from the Enlightenment time period. So what ends up happening is that the National Assembly, they kind of branch off and they create a new part of their government that is known as the Legislative Assembly. And the Legislative Assembly is like our Congress here in the United States. They do two things. They are going to create laws in France, and they are also going to approve or reject declarations of war. And that's exactly what our U.S. Congress does here in the United States. So once again, everyone, France is looking at countries like the United States for influence. They're looking at the United States for ideas. And they definitely borrow a lot of ideas from us, and they borrow a lot of the ideas from the Enlightenment philosophers and thinkers. So as all of this is going on in France, the countries that border and surround France start to freak out a little bit. They're starting to get a little anxious. They're starting to get a little nervous because those countries, like Austria, like Prussia, those countries are ruled also by an absolute monarch. And they are scared that if this is all happening in France, then why can't it also happen in their country? So Austria and Prussia pretty much give an ultimatum to France. And they tell the National Assembly, the new French government, that they need to restore Louis the 16th as an absolute monarch. And if they don't, then they are going to take action and they are going to invade France. Well, as a result of them giving this ultimatum to France, the Legislative Assembly, right off the bat, declares war. They don't do anything else, but they say they're not messing around, and they declare war on Austria and Prussia. Now, think about this. That's not a very good idea because France is experiencing this revolution in their country. They're experiencing lots of problems in their country already. So now, not only do they have to take care of all the problems happening in their country, but they also have to fight in this war against two major European countries. So because of this, riots break out in France. Austria and Prussia are moving closer into Paris. So the National Assembly, and the Legislative Assembly, they have to take drastic measures, and they put their constitution, they set it to the side, and they dispose the king, which means they no longer look at Louis XVI as a king, even a constitutional monarchy. They don't even look at him as a king. He's just a regular citizen now. And the government is actually shut down. And what they end up doing is they create a new government, which is the second government during the French Revolution, that is known as the National Convention. And the first thing that the National Convention does is abolishes the monarchy altogether. So before I mentioned they dispose the king, so they no longer look at him anymore. They no longer have a king. Louis, once again, is just a regular French citizen. And they also declare France a republic. Now, a republic is a form of democracy. And remember, democracy, under a democracy, the citizens have the power. And citizens have power by voting. So at this time, only adult male citizens could vote and hold office, government office jobs. Women, unfortunately, were not able to vote or even play a part in politics and government at this time. So there's going to be a group of people that kind of take the lead in the National Convention, and they are known as the Jacobins. And they are a radical political organization. They're a group, and they are very, very extreme. And the Jacobins will find Louis XVI guilty of treason. And remember what treason is? That's when you betray your own country. And they sentence Louis XVI to execution. They execute him by guillotine. And that's a big deal. And later on, his wife Marie Antoinette is also executed. So now the former absolute monarchs of France have just been executed by the guillotine. And at this point, uh, the Jacobins are going to start targeting French citizens that are not going along with this new government, that are not going along with the National Convention. Anyone that opposes the government, anyone that opposes the revolution, anyone that wants the monarchy back, anyone who wants the old French tradition back will be found guilty, and they will also be executed just like the king and queen. So this is a very, very scary time in France. And the guy that really takes over and becomes leader during this time period is known as Maximilien Robespierre. And he is the Jacobin leader who wants to wipe out every single trace of French tradition. He gets rid of the church, shuts down churches. No religion is allowed in France anymore. He replaces it with his own ideas and ideas of the revolution. And he is also responsible for the time period known as the Reign of Terror, which I'm hoping that we all remember. This was a 10-month period where almost 40,000 French citizens are going to be executed for opposing the government, for opposing the revolution. And it's, like I mentioned before, a really, really scary time. So this is going to go ahead and conclude our first part of the video lecture. Once again, guys, remember I mentioned in the very beginning of this lecture that the second half of this, the second half of the notes that you get to use on your exam is the notes that you guys took on Tuesday on Napoleon's three major mistakes. So once again, as always, if you need to go back and you need to review any of this, please go back, rewind, review. And if you have any questions, please ask.